be so sure? If I told you half the things I've heard about this Jabba the Hutt, you'd probably short-circuit.
Well, for episode 6, for the first time since episode 4, you go back to Tatooine. And now you get a much different view of Tatooine than you saw before in Jabba's palace. The setting being underground made it appear different than Tatooine above ground. When you think about all that was going on under the surface of it, it was so imaginative and a huge scale. There's this sort of creature sitting on this rock, and suddenly the tongue of the creature comes out. It was one of the early shots where George really started treating a lot of the environment with creatures that are kind of secondary to the story. That shot could have just been Meanwhile at the castle, but in fact it wasn't. He put in this other stuff to make it really interesting and more compelling and add a sense of more reality to it. And we shot that many, many different times, in many different ways, in many different designs, till we got something that was the right balance between an establishing shot of the castle, and by the way, here's something going on over here. And Phil Tippett designed that and designed a lot of the other creatures that were also in Jabba's palace.
Making things move. I mean, what if you cut a hole out of the wall right here? And he went in this way?
One of the great things about George, what he was just like totally inclusive and would meet with us once a week and say, make me a bunch of stuff. And we'll get together and we'll look at it. And we built like these little maquettes out of clay and Sculpey. And we paint these up and bring them in, and George would look at them. He said, okay, these I like. And he'd look at one and go like, so what's this? And he'd go like, that's a calamari man. And he'd go like, this is Admiral Akbar. Pink. and then so he would start weaving this stuff into the script that they were building. I think there was a couple of things that didn't make it into the final cut that were just like, there was some creature that was made out of light. That didn't make it, but pretty much everything else did.
And the skiff sequence, when they're on the surface of Tatooine, and the big creature that's sort of in the sinkhole was a pretty elaborate thing. It was shot in Yuma, Arizona.
You know, it was an intense shoot. The barge was built on this big platform that was maybe 30 or 40 feet above the desert floor. So it was elevated so they could build the Sarlacc pit down and then have the barge up above that. So there was a great deal of room beneath the dance floor. And so all of the horrible things that live out there and don't generally bother you, we had to be like really careful. Every time we like lifted a box, we'd do it with a stick to see if there was a rattlesnake or a scorpion or a tarantula. The dirt that was on the ground was kicked up this dust. The costumes were like sponges of human sweat. So once we wrapped, it was just like, you know, preparing for the next day. And by the time we got home, it was just, you know, George prepares and prepares and prepares. So everything is boarded and figured out. And I mean, the great thing with George was going into this stuff, you knew what you were doing and how you were going to do it. So when we saw the movie, that was the movie we shot.
You know, when I first saw Return of the Jedi, I had an entirely different impression of what Tatooine was like. It's just a bizarre, freaky place that is like your worst nightmare. It's something that was a real surprise to me when I saw it. I didn't know that all that stuff was actually going to be in the film, played that way. It made me never want to really visit Tatooine at all, if it actually existed.
If it's going right to left, it's good, because then you won't shoot against that road.
The Endor stuff, the stuff in the forest, the planet base sort of stuff, was shot in Northern California in the redwoods. A lot of it was apparently private redwood groves that were about to be harvested, and that's why they could go up there and actually knock some trees down and stuff, because 3 weeks later the trees would have been gone anyway. It meant, though, that you could do all sorts of things in a location like that. The worst we did was actually take some explosion and blast it up against a redwood tree that we could then put a speeder bike into it, and at the moment when the bike was supposed to hit the tree, we would transition to that explosion that was already on the tree that looked much more dangerous than it actually really was. It was hot, but it didn't hurt the tree at all. So Joe Johnston and I got together and we designed a sequence for it that it wasn't quite what George wanted. I mean, what did we know? So he redesigned something that was much more dramatic and filmic. And in order to sort of understand it, I got some G.I. Joe models and a piece of carpet that we'd found somewhere, and some sonnet tubes, some cardboard tubes, and made a little miniature set of a forest that was really crude, wasn't trying to look real or anything like that, but what we did essentially was like an animatic, and made the sequence with these little G.I. Joe dolls.
Roll it.
And that was a really fun sequence to shoot. It started out with Leia and Luke getting on the same bike. Both of them are chasing these two guys on separate bikes. And it ended with both speeder bike guys, I believe, being killed, and Leia's flown off, and Luke is left wondering where Leia is. And that way, I could sort of design what shots look like, which we did for 100 shots that we had in like about the 3-minute sequence. And then I could disassemble that footage and see how many we had looking forward, how many we had looking backwards, and how many shots looking this way, that way, to start to understand how to make it work. How do you actually shoot this? And I didn't want to do it with miniatures because that would have been the easiest. But I wanted to really get out there and have this thing look real. And we had the redwood forest nearby. So the trick, once I had that all figured out, was how do we move the camera through a redwood forest at 100 miles an hour. So I got the idea of using a Steadicam, which had just been invented a few years earlier, which is a camera stabilizing rig. And actually got Garrett Brown, who invented it, who flew out from the East Coast, and we did a test locally here at Samuel Taylor Park, and the thing actually worked. We put a camera on the Steadicam rig, and he walked through at a slow, steady pace, and we shot 1 frame of film every second. So for each step was a 24th of a second, and we got the equivalent of just over 100 miles an hour that way when you played the film back at 24 frames a second. And that meant that I could figure out how to do the whole sequence. So we did the front views that way. Running the film backwards gave us the rear views, same footage, running the other direction. We could mirror image the film, and it looked like a whole different shot. So for one walkthrough, we had essentially 4 angles. And we did a number of walkthroughs, so we had all sorts of combinations. Side shots we did from moving cars, and trucks, which were pretty easy to do, and those were shot in no time. And there were some other shots that were more elaborate, that we had to have more width that we could actually find in a forest. And we found a road, but to cover up the roadway, we just covered it up with dirt and all sorts of stuff so you wouldn't see it, and that's in a few shots. So with those 3 combinations, Steadicam, side view, or going along a road, and a front and rear view on a narrow road that we covered over with dirt and stuff, that gave all the backgrounds we needed. And then it was a matter of cutting them back together again in the order that the animatic had said they need to be. And then it was a matter of going through with the actors and shooting all the right angles against blue screen, and we could put them in, and it would look like when you reassembled it, it all was a dramatic sequence from beginning to end that lasted 3 minutes and 100 shots. So that was pretty neat.
There's a wonderful trick that good directors have, which is maintaining the fiction that the actors are making an important contribution, and George did that. And it's mostly about having a very clear idea of what it is that he wants. I'm not sure George ever gets what he wants, but he gets close enough so that when he gets in the editing room, he can pull together something that may well more closely resemble his ambition. It is amazing what you can do when you have a vision, when you have an ambition, and when you can bend other people's will to your desire. And despite the enormous difficulties of the production of Star Wars, the thing that kept it focused and directed towards the ambitions was George's vision and his passion for the idea. I mean, I always thought, you know, the character Luke Skywalker was George. George growing up. George facing conflict and the need to prove himself. And he did, powerfully. And so you'd see the character of Luke Skywalker change from one film to the next and develop in much the same way George was developing.
In Return of the Jedi, you see a reappearance of the Death Star, and there's a couple differences. One of them is that the Death Star this time is under construction, and the other is that the Emperor is actually on board the Death Star this time.
Yes, I know.
Philosophically, because this was the second attack on the Death Star that the audience was going to see, it had to be more complex than what you had seen in the first Star Wars film. And not only were there more ships involved, both in the style and design, but there was a greater number of them. There was also the added complexity of part of the Death Star battle happening out in space and part of it happening down on the planet, which because of the shield antenna had to be knocked out before they could make their attack. So they were cutting back and forth between two different locations in addition to a very much more complex sequence. Working on the sequence, it was almost dizzying the amount of spaceships that were in some of those shots, and they came up with several ways to cheat that. One of them was they would photograph the spaceships, and this was way back before Photoshop, so you would actually have to go in and shoot them on film, make prints, and then from those photos we would go in with an X-Acto knife and cut out the photos of the spaceships, place them on a pane of glass, and sometimes there would be 3 layers of glass, and then they would shoot that, so you'd get, 70, 80 ships in one single pass rather than having to shoot each one of them individually. We also got closer to the models. There were a number of models that were built specifically for the attack on the Death Star sequence at the end. One of them was the band on the Death Star itself. We built a very large-scale model of that so the camera could skim along that. And we went back and repainted it, and then it became the band section on Darth Vader's Star Destroyer. We built about a 6-foot wide section of the conning tower on the regular Star Destroyer for some very close shots on that. In Star Wars, there was the famous trench battle, which at the time was just absolutely amazing, with all the fighters flying down into the surface trench on the Death Star. And looking back, that was a fairly simple thing to do with your camera because it's not completely enclosed. You can have a boom arm coming in, holding the camera, going down the trench. Well, taking it to the next level on Return of the Jedi, they actually went inside the Death Star, and so you had equipment all around you. And that had to be created in such a way that pieces came out. So every shot you see where you're going down a tunnel, there are model makers and stagehands off to the side waiting as the camera would slowly move down. If a piece got out of the frame, they would go in and move it out, and then the camera would move on even further, and then they'd pull the next one out, like a big zipper in a way. It's interesting in life. Sometimes you go in thinking you want one thing, and then you come out on the other side going, wow, that was great, but not for why I thought it was going to be great. And for me, seeing Star Wars, I was in high school when the first Star Wars came out, and I looked at the screen and I said, that's what I want to do. That looks like so much fun. And within a few years, I was actually working in the model shop on Return of the Jedi, and that was a dream come true. But looking back on that experience, the people that I was able to work with and see and observe and learn from was infinitely more valuable than just the surface of working on a movie that I really enjoyed. It became this experience, this life experience, which has led up to today. I'm here 30 years later.